Let's look at the institutional favorite now. Now, I actually traded and bought Cisco early on here. It went IPO in 1990 and came off of that first IPO base. And I actually traded it for, I forget it was a very small trade, very small move. And then the stock had this giant move. I think it was 70 or 80,000% and went up over, about the next decade. But once you got where this stock made this giant move, I mean, it was just considered as like completely bulletproof. I think they had 16 straight quarters of triple digit earnings. It was just considered, a must own, even when it first cracked and it was down 50, 60, 70%. Everybody I knew at the gym, they were buying it down. Oh my God, I bought Cisco down 70%. What a bargain. This stock has still not recovered. It's been, 20 years, and that stock is still, I don't think to this day, it's not even back to break even, right, Dave?
Yeah, it hasn't gotten to back to that high of 2000. It's getting closer, but 21 years later. So
now you turn into this stalwart, if you will, or turn into this laggard where, these can stay indefinitely, where they don't make big moves, or they just, they top and they don't go anywhere for, decades. So and this is the same story every single cycle going back 100 years. You go back to the 1970s. Xerox was like, high tech. That was like the high tech company of the day. Of course, later was IBM, going into the 80s and so forth. But Xerox and Kodak and Eastman Kodak, those two were super high tech in the 1970s. They topped from the 70s, in the 70s market top. Those stocks topped, and then it was 24 years before they even got back to break even. And during that time, the S&P 500 went up 500%, and all kinds of market leaders made huge, enormous, multi-1,000% gains during that period. And meanwhile, you got to buy Eastman Kodak, you got to buy Xerox when it's down. Avon Products is probably the ultimate example of that.
Yeah, and I think this is an important point, that there's a huge difference between a great company and a great stock. You could have a great company and it's had a great reputation, and it's grown over so many years. But if that growth starts slowing down, it could be a horrible stock. Even though it's still a great company, probably a great company to work for, you really have to separate. You want a great company and you want a great stock at the exact same time. Who wants to sit with a stock for 21 years? Yes, you got a great name, but your money is not being treated the way it should.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. And taking a look here, Qualcomm, back in the 1990s, Qualcomm was all the rage. I mean, that was hotter than any stock that I've seen, even in recent times, where we've had some pretty hot names with these meme stocks and all kinds of just these quick, fast movers and SPAC area and all that. Qualcomm, though, was just a cult following around Qualcomm, and another number of names, which were basically kind of like the FANG names back then. These were the FANG stocks, and by the time they made these big, huge, multi-1,000% moves, all the institutions owned them, and again, 21 years to get back to break even. So, I mean, yeah, you can look and say, well, if I bought it when it was down here, I did great. Yeah, if you happen to, buy it right at the low, but, which 50% decline would have been the one that you would have picked? The first one, the second one, the third one, the fourth one, just kept cutting in half and cutting in half. The chances that you would time it that well is practically zero. It's real quick, Dave, because I had a point that I wanted to make, and I can't remember. What did you just say previously?
I said that there's a huge difference between a company, a great company that has a great reputation, and a great stock. It would be great to have both, but if the stock is not performing well, no matter what its reputation is, you shouldn't be in that stock. And you might have said this, or someone said that the only good stocks are stocks that go up. You don't want stocks that go down and just go sideways for years.
That's precisely where I was going with this, and I forgot that point I was going to make. So thank you. The point that I was going to make was that my number one rule, and I learned this from O'Neill, was all stocks are bad unless they're going up. That is literally my absolute number one rule, is that I don't look at any stock as a good stock or even a good company unless the price is going up, unless it's performing. If it's not performing, then it's not a good stock. And it doesn't matter if it's a good company. Good companies could make terrible investments for decades and decades, and some of them go out of business. Whether it's Coca-Cola. I mean, a lot of people look at, well, what about Warren Buffett and this and that? Well, again, that's, first of all, Warren Buffett is not getting super performance, not getting triple-digit returns. He's beat the S&P by, I don't know, 3 or 4%. And there's also, you could look at Berkshire Hathaway, there's been, declines of, 50, 60%, or I don't know if that number is exact, but certainly, 50% declines. Coca-Cola, was his prize investment, and that got into a lot of trouble and took a long time. To this day, it's been a laggard for a long time. So let's keep moving along here. We're gonna talk about this stuff really in depth, and start really zooming in. But I got to finish giving you this overall perspective on these 4 areas here. So the turnaround situation. When you think of Apple Computer, most people do not think of a turnaround situation, because Apple's been doing so good for so long, and it's such an incredibly dominant part of our life and in the economy, and the products, of course, are so amazing that you don't think of it that way. But Apple Computer was almost out of business several times. Steve Jobs, of course, was booted out of the company. And again, this points out a few things. First of all, a turnaround situation, you can get a company that at one time is doing great and then falls on hard times, and then refocuses and comes back and turns into sometimes even a much better investment than it was originally. Here's what I want to look at here, though. Is you can see that the iPod was released, iTunes Store, the iPhone. All this was on the table. Jobs came back. This was, if you go back to search the archives in the 1990s, when Steve Jobs came back, there was a Barron's article, and they asked me about Apple, and I said I was bullish on Apple because Steve Jobs was back on the job. And that was sort of my little catch line, or little phrase that I put. And that was in this period right here where they didn't even have the iPhone yet. This was based on iPod and an iTunes release later on in 2000. So the iPhone came out, and all this was on the table well before the stock even made its first big move up. And of course, Apple has still been doing well. But a lot of people call Apple the great turnaround now, and we're going to look at that later on. We're going to look at what happened with Apple, and as far as it was a story of eroding margins, and then an amazing story of expanding margins. So we'll talk about that in just a little bit. I want to talk about cyclical stocks here for a minute, because cyclical stocks have to be treated a little bit differently than your normal type growth stock. The thing with cyclical stocks is that they don't have these secular moves. They can't sustain the earnings growth over decades, and sometimes not even over many years, because of course they're cyclical. They move up and down with the economy. So what will happen with those is a lot of times, most of the time, the right time to buy a cyclical is when the PE is actually super high and all the news is bad. They're cutting the dividend. It just, everything looks terrible. But the stock is setting up. It's setting up from, coming out of a base. And then when the earnings are real strong, you'll see these giant earnings because they're going against these horrible comps from the, recession. Dividends are being raised. The PE actually comes down because now the earnings come in. It knocks the PE down and all the news is good. That's when you want to sell them. So cyclicals have what we call an inverse PE cycle, or an inverse maturation cycle with the fundamentals. So you have to look at these a little bit different. So this is why I'm pointing out, and showing you these various areas that we look at, because each of them have certain characteristics and certain things that you're going to look for that are going to affect on how you play those areas. Let me show you one other last thing here as far as the the cyclical area, or what I call a commodity play. This is sort of a unique situation that you're not going to see too often, but I'm just going to give you an idea of how this works. So back in going back in 2004, 2005, copper prices took off and they doubled, and they made this big move. And I saw some copper stocks that were setting up, and I took a look at a little bit deeper into the company and found that this company, Encore Wire, they made copper wire. They had a huge stockpile of copper that they had already purchased and that they could make wire with. But now during that time that they already purchased this big stockpile of copper wire, copper prices just blasted off. So copper prices went up 100%. And then after that, they went up much more. They were up hundreds of percent. What this did was it gave them a automatic big boost in their profit margins, because they can now pass that price increase on to their customers, because they locked in the price of copper. They already bought it and stockpiled it. So I would never buy a stock based on just that. But this stock was coming out of a perfect base. It set up, everything was looked just right. It met all the criteria, and this was sort of the reason behind it, at least that I could find. And the stock made a really nice move, and I got a double out of it in a pretty short period of time. So this is another way where you can look at sort of a commodity area in the market and see, if there's a way to play that. But again, like I said, they have inverse cycles, so you have to be a little more careful with the way you play the cyclicals.
The other thing I would add to cyclicals and commodity plays is that sometimes they move when growth stocks are starting to falter. Maybe growth stocks have had a big move, and then there's still good money in the market, and the cyclicals start coming on. So there are times when growth is not going to work, but the market's going to move over to these. It happened, I remember, after a great move off the 1982 low in 82 into 83, then it switched to more value type of stocks and cyclical stocks in 1984, until the market came back and had a great move in 85. So it happens from time to time. So you just be aware of that. But I think you'll still make your most money when you're in growth types of stocks.